stopped. Well. I hit. Is it recording right now? I did hit start recording, and it's going, but I did that earlier, so I don't know what happened. Hopefully, if there's something there, and they can splice that together. All right. So when we get from Genesis 23 and move on into Genesis 24, what we're actually getting here is a transition. Consider the idea that Eve is the initial matriarch that's given to us as the mother of all living, and that Abraham, stepping into this role, kind of takes on the mantle and responsibilities of Adam as something of a new Adam. Then naturally, his one wife becomes the new matriarch after Eve. And the same can be said as we're transitioning away from Sarah, who's now died, to the new patriarch. Abraham's soon about to die, and Isaac's going to step into that role. And for all intent and purpose, the story's focus has transitioned away from him anyway. And now we're about to get in chapter 24 to recognizing who the new matriarch is going to be as Isaac has a wife brought to him. So when we work through that story, which we will touch on just a little bit, eventually it results in Rebekah leaving the land of her ancestors, Padan Aram, the place of Abraham's people, to come and dwell with a man she's never met before, that she is now going to be joined to forever in the bond of marriage. And they too are going to share this Canaan space, this new provincial Eden. And once Abraham dies, this plot of land that he has purchased, as we just identified, is going to pass on to Isaac. So he too will come to own Ephron's field, sacred space with trees. So I just hope that we're starting to pick up on that. But just in case we're not quite grasping that, look down at the bottom of the screen, and I think this might help just advance that theme a little bit more, because here's another layer of parallel that gives it a bit more depth. Remember in Genesis chapter 2, we've got God giving the man and his wife the clear command, as they're now in this sacred space, to not eat any forbidden fruit from the tree that they are told to refrain from. Consider when we work through the Noah story, what happens with respect to the incident of Ham looking on his father's nakedness. I know we really didn't go any measure of detail with respect to that, but I think we're all pretty familiar with that story. When Noah comes to learn of what it is that he has done, then Noah speaks prophetically and delivers what? On who? A curse on Canaan. So considering the idea that these people are to basically take the position of perpetual slaves and be servants of their older brothers, henceforth and forevermore, and we haven't got to the point of the narrative or place in the narrative yet where this curse takes on a much graver note with respect to the idea of all of these people are supposed to be annihilated. There's only been the brief hint in Genesis 15 of the measure of the sin of the Amorites not reaching full capacity yet. But when that happens, well, we know what's going to come with respect to the development of the story. But the idea is perhaps that's part of why Abraham, and no doubt, and living in the land for decades now, has witnessed the gross immorality of these people and would have more than one reason for entrusting this servant of his to not allow his son to marry any of these women. And remember, Isaac's roughly 40 years old. He's not an immature teenage boy by no means who is intellectually and socially inept and incapable of making such a wise choice. I mean, he's almost lived half of his life already, and for some reason, he's not married. But be that as it may, going off to grab a woman from a place outside of this land, because there will come a time when the pronouncement upon the descendants of Canaan, all of Abraham's neighbors and the people that will spawn from them as they continue to give their sons and daughters to one another in marriage, are going to come to that climactic moment of expulsion, and it's not going to be an easy come, easy go. It's going to be a nasty, horrific, bloody conflict. No doubt this will be a bit of a conflict of interest, correct? If way back to the beginning of their lineage with respect to one of their founding patriarchs, he married a Canaanite woman, and many of the people in the country now, they share a close kinship with by means of blood relation. There's that piece to it, but it's just a simple idea. These people, in a sense, are kind of marked off as being out of bounds, off limits, forbidden in a way, even though that express command has not been given. Go back to Genesis 3, though. What happens after the command is given to the man and the woman, and the shining one comes slithering his way on into the garden, and he begins to question that. Did God really say? Well, I don't think it's coincidental when we actually get into the narrative space where now this servant has gone over there to Abraham's kinsfolk, and when he starts talking to Rebekah after She is identified for us as being the answer to the prayer the servant laid down before he met her and then goes to Laban's house and so forth, and Laban being her brother and her father there as well, to decide the matter on, okay, are we going to give up our daughter/sister to go and marry this master of yours who is the son of our kinsman Abraham? And they agree up front. They can't seem to be ecstatic enough. But then the next day, he wants to get up and leave, and the first thing that they say is, hey, why are they so hasty? Why don't you let the girl just stay here with us for 10 days? And then after a 10-day celebration, during that time period, we can all say our goodbyes and our well wishes, and then eventually we can wind up sending you off. And again, could be making much of this, but one of the things that could have easily come from that is well, consider the idea that Rebekah was ready to go. When they asked her, what do you want? Do you want to go and be this man's wife? Again, a man she's never heard of, never met, and at this point, she's all but agreed to it by virtue of the fact she's wearing the nose ring, the bracelets, the other accoutrements that he brought to mark her off as being chosen now and espoused to another man. They didn't have to give her the chance to consent, agree, or even speak on the matter, but they do. And she says yes. But then there comes this proposition of, well, you could linger here for 10 more days. What do you think could happen over that 10-day period? She might sit and let this ruminate a bit more in her mind, especially if other people are starting to ask, do you really want to go and marry a man you've never met before? I mean, just because this servant came here with all these trinkets doesn't mean his master is as wealthy as he says, and on and on. In a sense, I think this might be echoing Eden in the idea of a temptation being offered for the woman to say, well, on second thought, but no, the servant doesn't take that, knowing that it could be seen as a measure of disrespect to the close kinsman of his own master, Abraham, to who he alone is accountable to. Yet he says, do not detain me. Let me go home. And okay, fine. If she wants to go, do you want to go? Yes, I want to go. Then by all means, Godspeed to you, well wishes, get on your way, travel as soon as you can. So in a sense, unlike Genesis 3, there actually is hope here in the obedience of a servant. So does that make sense? Are we picking up on some of these echoes of Eden in this story? I know it's a little broader than that when we jump down into the narrative and we're reading about the passing of Sarah, and certainly it's supposed to be a somber note. But what's the real meaning of why we're even given this measure of detail about where she's buried and the transaction of buying the land and what's even in the space, for crying out loud? It doesn't matter. We're not given any description of what else is in Canaan, and there's just a dank, damp cave out there that he is now going to use for burial ground. None of this we would ever find spectacular, but Moses points this out for a reason. And he's connecting the dots from one story panel to the next. And picking up on these things help us understand not just the stupid facts of the story, but at the same time, what God is doing in the midst and background of all of this. That this has now become an essential promissory note on what is going to come, because as Abraham is in a frustrated sense in Genesis 15 asking God, how will I know that I will possess this land before he closes his eyes in death, as his wife is the first to pass? This is something he actually gets to tangibly give to his son as a measure of saying, indeed, God has been faithful. And indeed, God intends to do this design-wise with respect to what he wants from our people and what he is ultimately going to do in somehow giving us a land that stretches from here all the way to the Euphrates. All right, so now that we're starting to get the wheels turning a bit and working on identifying patterns, let's look at some more patterns. All right, we move from Genesis 24, which is the story of how Rebekah winds up becoming Isaac's wife, and in a sense kind of succors some of that sadness that had happened by the tragic passing of his mother, even though he had her for 40 years at this point. Nonetheless, when we get into Genesis 25, Abraham dies. But if you stop for a second, even though there's a lot of space between Genesis 25 and Genesis 35, and it's not patterns that would normally stand out unless you're noticing subtle details in the text that seem to, again, in that chiastic way, parallel each other. As soon as Abraham dies, we're given a genealogy. Why does that happen? I'm sure a lot of us have probably looked a little bit questioningly at the book of Genesis and wondered, I kind of understand why there are so many genealogies. I mean, it's important, correct, to go from Adam to the next important son, which is Seth, and then to get from Seth all the way down to Noah, and then Noah to Abraham. So I can see the connective tissue there. But Ishmael is not part of the story really anymore. I mean, after all, in Genesis 17, when circumcision is given, even though he's circumcised, God is saying it's not going to be him. It's going to be the son that your wife Sarah will bear unto you. I'm not obligated, but I will care for this son. I will provide for him, and I will make something of him, though he was never a part of the intended agenda in the first place. Okay, so then God says that. Do we really need a genealogy to prove that was the case? Or, better yet, how many times have we read in some book or heard in some lesson or so forth about the reason why that genealogy for Isaac or Ishmael is there is just simply to prove that God was faithful? Because we count the generations, and God said he will make 12 tribes descend from him, the same as would wind up coming eventually, though God does not say that in the space now. We understand eventually that's exactly what will happen with another son, that being Jacob. But do we really need a list of names to show that God was faithful? Is there any other reason why this is given to us? Perhaps there is. Because when we skip a few pages, maybe more than a few pages, over to Genesis 35, we see the same structure. Abraham is the conduit of the promise. Isaac is that promised son that God had to painstakingly clarify for Abraham. It is him, it's not Ishmael. And now, in Genesis 25, we come to recognize that he didn't just stop at Isaac. He had 6 more sons. And most of those names are lost to us in complete obscurity with the exception of one. You might know that name as Midian. And Midian does have a significant space for us as the narrative will develop later on, considering it's the place where Moses winds up going to stay for 40 years, considering that's where his father-in-law, a high priest who winds up coming out to bless the God of Israel, as we referenced last week, also winds up attaching himself to the nation in a way because some of his own kinsmen depart with them on their journey and stay with them in the wilderness for 40 years and then enter into the land. And then, of course, there's the problem of what happens in Numbers with the Midianite people seducing the Israelites. So the point is that Midian does not get lost to us in obscurity. They are a near neighbor and at times a source of joy and at times, more often than not, a terrible thorn in their side. Point is that they are as much a son of Abraham as Isaac is and as Ishmael is, but they're not part of the covenant promise. So Isaac winds up dying, and then right after that, we have another genealogy. Now, if we're thinking to ourselves, well, okay, so Ishmael, it was said of him he is going to become the father of 12 tribes, and we're given his genealogy in Genesis 25 to prove the point that God was faithful. Nothing of the sort was said of Esau. Nothing. So why are we given Esau's genealogy? Why does that matter? Well, because they kind of live as their neighbors, south by southwest, just right outside the southern deserts of Judah, referred to as the Negev or the Arabah. As soon as you get through that, there's Edom. And again, just like Midian, Edom will have a significant point in the story along the way for several centuries. Even the prophets will be talking about them long after they've entered the land and started with kings and whatever else. But nothing is said of Esau and God making a great nation of him. So why give the genealogy? To keep the pattern going. To show us there's the son of promise and there's the son who is rejected. And that while he doesn't just simply fade off into obscurity, the point that's eventually going to wind up coming closed circuit for us is that God is extending something of grace to them as well. They are not the conduit by which the promise is going to be fulfilled, but God doesn't just simply write them off into complete oblivion, never to be thought of or remembered again. They are rejected and cast off for reasons according to God's own sovereignty. But there are hope and promises, or there is hope and there are promises made concerning them and their redemption, even after judgment is cast later on in the future. In Genesis 25, we then close the chapter out with the story of how Esau became rejected. And then, as we go from 25 to the beginning of 26, we have the covenant heir confirmed in Isaac. So in essence, what I'm showing you is simply this. You've got Abraham, and then as he dies, we have the genealogy of Ishmael. And then right after that, we have Isaac coming into center focus in the story. And what that proves to us is that Ishmael was cast off, rejected. Isaac is the center point of focus because he is the one that the covenant promises are confirmed with. The same thing happens after Isaac dies. Isaac dies, and then after that, we get the genealogy of Esau, because he also is the cast-off son. And so if we're seeing a pattern develop there, then what should we expect here, right after that? A genealogy. Now, when we get over to Genesis 37, which is where we'll start next week, something a little interesting happens there. And I'm going to use this slide to reference that when we get there. But for the sake of the conversation tonight, I'm just going to skip ahead and say we have to kind of leapfrog past Genesis 37 into Genesis 38, because in Genesis 37, there is no genealogy given. We are just jumping right into the Joseph story. The next genealogy that is given, in a sense, is what happens in 38 with the story of Judah. That's kind of ill-fitting if you think about it, because we start with Joseph and the whole idea of him having these weird dreams, and then he's sold off into slavery. And before we pick back up with that in Egypt, we've got this story of Judah and his sons dying, and then a daughter-in-law who masquerades as a prostitute, who almost comes to die because of her sins of infidelity, but of course she's the one who ultimately outs Judah for his lack of righteousness. And two more sons are born by virtue of that, who carry the narrative forward as they are, in a sense, the sons of promise, through which kings and ultimately Messiah will come through. So we get the promise confirmed with Judah. It's just not quite as dramatic as it is with Isaac, because no promise is made to Judah in the sense that you are going to own all of this land, and I'm going to make you fruitful and multiply you and make you a great nation and all those things. But as Genesis closes out, of the list of names in Genesis 49 of all the sons of Jacob, the one and only son that really stands out in the pack is Judah. And we'll get to that when the time comes. All right. And then as Genesis 26 kind of picks up a bit more steam, I think another thing that's important for us to notice is that God is intentionally interjecting himself to kind of break the cycle. So let me just jump into that real quick. Oh, well, before I do, just as a side note, I wanted to mention this little thing over here on the side that's in orange, because that will be a seed we pick up later on. What I want to reference there is that, here we have Abraham dying, then Isaac dying, and the next one after him is Jacob. When Jacob dies, then the next genealogy that's given to us, if we're following this pattern, should be that of the rejected son. The next genealogy we run into is in the book of Exodus, and it starts with Reuben. And Reuben, the firstborn son, is no longer the son of prominence because of his acts of indiscretion with his stepmother, Jacob's other wife. But anyway, we'll pick that up when the time comes. So, identifying more patterns, let's jump over to Genesis 26 and read the first 5 verses. Genesis 26, first 5 verses. So, there was another famine in the land in addition to the one that had occurred in Abraham's time. Isaac went to Abimelech, the king of the Philistines at Gerar. The Lord appeared to him and said, "Do not go down to Egypt. Live in the land I tell you about. Stay in this land as an alien, and I will be with you and bless you, for I will give you all these lands to you and to your offspring. And I will confirm the oath that I swore to your father Abraham. I will make your offspring as numerous as the stars of the sky. I will give your offspring all these lands, and all the nations of the earth will be blessed by your offspring. Because Abraham listened to me and kept my mandate, my commands, my statutes, and my instructions." The very first concept of covenant is laid down for us in Genesis chapters 1 and 2 with the words that God speaks to Adam, speaking about how he, as being blessed by the Lord, is now to be fruitful, multiply, fill the earth, subdue it, rule every aspect of the domains that God has placed under his authority, and then God puts him in the sacred space of the garden, charges him to work and to guard, watch, or keep, whichever word your translation uses. When we move further down, just taking Noah out of the picture because I don't really have space to include him on here too, but looking at Abraham, we see the exact same thing happening. And we've talked about that, so I won't necessarily go into that in much greater depth or detail than I already have, other than to simply try to, looking across the screen, I've paired these boxes up with each other so that hopefully you can appreciate the verbology and the phraseology of the words that God is using to carry forth this covenant pattern. With Abraham, he says, I will make you into a great nation. Even though he does not use the words verbatim like he did with Noah in be fruitful, multiply, fill the earth. To speak of Abraham becoming a great nation, who at the point when this particular promise is made is a childless man, has no descendants whatsoever. There is no possible way in the eyes of conventional human wisdom this man will ever amount to anything great. Certainly it cannot be said that when his name is changed from Abram to Abraham, he could become the father of many nations, when at that point he is still childless outside of the one son who in God's eyes really doesn't even count. But yet, this is what God is referring back to in saying he would make him a great nation, because he is going to multiply him exponentially. That's, of course, what he is carrying over with respect to Isaac, saying, I'm going to bless you in the same way that Abraham was meant to be blessed. And then Jacob, I'm with you, and I will watch over you wherever you go, intending to bring you back to this place and to make you fruitful and to multiply you. Now, the boxes in green at the bottom of Abraham's column are just some phrases or sentences that God is attaching to this as the covenant itself kind of builds in a little bit more of its expounding depth and detail, because God speaks this in just 3 short verses at the beginning of chapter 12. But he reiterates it several points in the narrative as he re-meets with Abraham in Genesis 15, 17, 22, and so forth. And in all of these places, we get a better understanding of how God intends to multiply him. Case in point, that first green box. Look at the sky, count the stars. Your offspring will be that numerous. He says the exact same thing to Isaac in Genesis 26. And then several chapters later, when Jacob is about to leave Canaan, meeting God here at Bethel, God speaks to him with that vision of this ladder structure with angels ascending and descending on it, and it's reaching into heaven but touching earth at the same time, and God is at the top of it. And he hears God's voice give this promissory note of your offspring will be like the dust of the earth. Not quite like the stars, but yet this is the same thing that God said to Abraham, comparing his offspring to both stars and dust in the plentiful nature that they are. Your offspring will be like the dust of the earth, and you will spread all over the place. So the idea is that we are continuing this pattern of God developing this covenant structure and passing it on from, in this case, it's not leapfrogging several generations as we had with Adam to Noah, but one generation to the next. And while God does not pick a single person out in every generation to pass this whole bundle of promises to, the idea is to make sure that we understand the main trunk of the tree, the branches that are being lopped off that are not significant, and then watch with great anticipation to see how God is going to continue moving this agenda forward. Because in a real way, it winds up falling into silence and some measure of obscurity. After Genesis 49, when God promises that kings are going to come from Judah. But then we get from that into the Exodus story, all the way up to the end of Deuteronomy, and well, it's the whole nation. So who is the one that carries this promise forward? And nobody really steps into that limelight until David winds up coming along, yet further down the road, several centuries and several generations. But we wait, right? And we wait because we've been looking at this pattern develop, and we appreciate that God has not shelved this project. He means to sow the seeds and see it wind up coming back to him full fold. All right, identifying some more patterns. Picking up a little bit more in Genesis 26, I want to read starting in verse 22. So at that time, Abimelech, accompanied by Phicol, the commander of his army, said to Abraham, God is with you in everything you do. Swear to me by God here and now that you will not break an agreement with me or with my children and descendants. As I have been loyal to you, so you will be loyal to me and to the country where you reside as an alien. And Abraham said, I swear it. I am in the wrong chapter. This is back in Genesis 21. Forgive me for that. Genesis 21, verse 22. I'm sorry. I've got this.
I know.
Yeah. I saw Judy over here kind of looking around, and I'm like, oh, I don't know why she's confused. I told her where to go. And then I realized, hold on, wait a minute. I hit the word Abraham, and I'm like, well, maybe I mentioned the wrong chapter. So anyway, Genesis 21, starting in verse 22. But I am going to pick up in verse 25. But Abraham complained to Abimelech because of the well that Abimelech's servants had seized. Abimelech replied, I don't know who did this thing. You did not report anything to me, so I haven't heard about it until today. Abraham took flocks and herds and gave them to Abimelech, and the two of them made a covenant. Abraham separated 7 ewe lambs from the flock, and Abimelech said to Abraham, Why have you separated these 7 ewe lambs? He replied, You are to accept the 7 ewe lambs from me, so that this act will serve as my witness that I dug this well. Therefore, that place was called Beersheba, because it was there that the two of them swore an oath. After they had made a covenant at Beersheba, Abimelech and Phicol, the commander of his army, left and returned to the land of the Philistines. Abraham planted a tamarisk tree in Beersheba, and there he called on the name of the Lord, the everlasting God. And Abraham lived as an alien in the land of the Philistines for many days. And now when we actually go to chapter 26, where I faked you out before, and we start in verse 26, chapter 26, verse 26, there's a reason why this should sound familiar. Now Abimelech, although we should understand generationally this is probably not the same guy, Abimelech, more than anything, is probably a title that is borne by the Philistine king at this moment. And these Philistines may not actually be the same Philistines of the later stories of the Judges and on into 1 Samuel and so forth. They have a totally different structure. 5 cities, 5 different kings. It's a little strange. We can pick back up with that later, but for the sake of this story. Now Abimelech came to him, this is Isaac, from Gerar with Ahuzeth, his advisor, and Phicol, the commander of his army. Isaac said to him, Why have you come to me? You hated me. You sent me away from you. They replied, We have clearly seen how the Lord has been with you, just as a previous Abimelech had said to Isaac's predecessor, Abraham. We think there should be an oath between 2 parties, between us and you. Let us make a covenant with you. You will not harm us, just as we have not harmed you, but have done only what has been good to you, sending you away in peace. You are now blessed by the Lord. So Isaac does not give 7 ewe lambs as a witness to a covenant that's being made or an oath taken, but instead he prepares a banquet for them. They ate, they drank, they got up early in the morning, they swore an oath to each other. Isaac went or sent them on their way, and they left him in peace. And on that same day, Isaac's servants came to tell him about the well they had dug, saying, We found water. He called it Sheba. Therefore, the name of the city is still Beersheba today. Well, wait a minute. I thought it was already named Beersheba. So did it lose its name somewhere in the transitional time between Abraham when Isaac was probably a little boy, and that now Isaac is a grown man off into his middle-aged years, and he's digging another well, and they decide to call that place Beersheba too? No, it's one and the same. It's just helping us understand not only are we situating this place geographically as the place in the previous story account of Genesis 21, but to help us understand the significance of the well being. And have you ever stopped to wonder, why is it these stories all seem to bear out these same details? What happens with Hagar when she winds up running away from Sarah, when Sarah is disciplining her for her being so haughty? She runs out into the desert. She stops because she can't go any further. The angel of the Lord finds her. He talks to her about what's going to come in the future, as goes this child of hers that she has conceived. And all of this transpires by what? A well. The same thing happens when Abraham actually sends her away. And now she thinks that her and the boy are going to die. The angel comes again, but tells her not to go back, but to go somewhere else. And yet he is still going to bless and prosper them as a family. And this transpires too by a well. Why is it that we have all these things happening by wells? Do you think it's coincidental, or is it possible that there actually might be something of an Eden connection that's going on here as well? Let's just hold that thought in place for a second, and let's go through this schematic just a bit. After God makes the covenant with Abraham in Genesis 12, the first time he comes to call Abraham, and he speaks to him about all that he wants him to do, the very next sequence in the story is him going into Egypt, and what happens? He deceives Pharaoh. We know how that story transpires. Now we move on to Genesis 20 on into 21, and the same thing winds up happening. Except for this time, it's not Pharaoh, it's Abimelech, the king of the Philistines, ruling in Gerar, and he almost lost his wife for the sake of making the same silly mistake, but thankfully God rescues and redeems. And by virtue of that, we have something of a conflict between them, but it gets resolved by virtue of Abraham praying and then a covenant being made, as goes what's going to happen in the future between these two nations in the immediate generations that follow them now, with the idea of, hey, your guys kind of covered up my well, and we need the well because we've got lots of sheep, we've got lots of flocks and herds and all that stuff. Well, I didn't know about that. Well, hey, now that you do, please take this as a measure of a token between the two of us to say, as you are hoping, I won't harm you, you won't harm me, and you guys will leave my well alone, and we will live and dwell together in harmony with each other. Absolutely. Sounds great. But the idea is that covenant and then terrible decision on the part of Abraham. What has just happened here in Genesis 26? The story here opens up with God appearing to Isaac, unprovoked, to say, everything that I promised Abraham, I am now giving to you. And he uses the exact same terms to do that with. And then as we move from that part of the story into the very next sequence in the story panel, what do we have but him doing the same thing his father did with either the same king or the next king that came after, going by the title of Abimelech, with lying about the status of this woman that he is living with as being a sister as opposed to a wife. Why do you think that's patterned like that? God appearing, speaking, giving covenant, entering in relationally with respect to what he hopes to accomplish through Abraham and now Isaac, and then them making boneheaded choices. Where else do we have in the story so far with God entering into covenant with an image bearer and then giving instruction and then promises and then right after that, boneheaded decisions being made? And what is this space supposed to reflect and represent? I mean, it's all there. It keeps getting repackaged and put to us again and again to show us that while God isn't done with the project, man finds new boneheaded ways to just keep screwing it up. But yet God is faithful, God is merciful, and again, God redeems. On to that third box there. He covenants with Abimelech to honor his well. The same thing winds up happening there with respect to Isaac, and then a celebration. Now, it's the exchange of animals in a one-way fashion, in the sense that Abraham is giving blessing to Abimelech, a king who probably doesn't need these animals, hence the reason why he's asking, what do you mean by this? I didn't bring anything for you. This could be seen as a measure of disrespect on my part, and I certainly don't want, hey, let me send some servants back to go get me some animals. No, it's not what I mean. I want to give from my wealth to you so that you understand I do and truly not mean or intend any harm to come to you. This is what you want. You've sought peace, and I seek peace with you as well. I choose to bless you. What was it that God said he intended to do through Abraham all the way back in Genesis 12? And he will do what to those who bless him? What do we have going on with respect to Isaac here? Isaac doesn't decide to give lambs. Instead, he decides to kill some of them and to prepare a feast in a hasty manner. As goes the customs of the times, you don't serve bread without, or a meat, I gave it away. You don't serve meat without wine or bread. And if you don't have time for the bread to rise, the yeast to do its fermenting job, you're going to be making what kind of bread? So if you consider the idea of slaughtered animal, feast, unleavened bread, you've got the basic quintessential elements of what? Passover. And what is Passover supposed to preclude? What does it come before? It comes before an exodus to mark the end of exile. What does this have to do with exile or exodus? Not much, except for the fact that God is continuing to show us his hand of the idea. Isaac, as that promised son, is the place marker to help move the ball forward toward this grand goal and prize of redemption of the nations and blessing through Abraham's people to the furthest extent of the world. Back to Abraham's story, we have images of Eden with respect to animals, water in the form of a well, the planting of a tree. Now that part of the story is not given to us with respect to Isaac, but why does Abraham plant a tree? And again, if we're able to recognize the quintessential elements of a Passover observance, even though the feast hasn't been instituted yet God is winking toward that, what do we have here? The quintessential elements of what space? For a minute, let's just pretend this is not the cave site where his dead wife is. Eden. We've got the quintessential elements of this sacred space where God intended originally to bless all humanity before Adam made his choice to rebel against God. But what God continues to try to draw our attention back to, and what he wants to dump the contents out of to bless the world. It's a small token, but it's that. It's a token flashing toward what is a blessing here of one man who is carving out a new nation and a new race that did not exist before him, that God has said and promised is destined to bless all the nations, by which he is doing so in crossing the proverbial aisle to a man who is Gentile and is not part of this covenant blessing. and in a sense are marked for destruction by virtue of the fact they occupy this land. But yet in the moment, they can mutually benefit, and should they choose to acquiesce and honor the God of Abraham, someday they will find that ultimate blessing. So, and I think that's kind of what's going on here too, with Isaac having this celebratory feast with Abimelech and his entourage of advisors and so forth, is to bring that Eden blessing to them. After all, is this not what was going on when Melchizedek descended from Jerusalem to meet Abraham out on the field, bringing with him bread and wine? I think so. Now, you can tell me I'm off base in that, and I'd be more than happy to try to help clear up anything that I may have confused you on. So, have I got anybody stuck in the mud so far? All right, moving on to Genesis 27. Let's read some verses from that chapter. Let's jump over to Genesis 27, and we'll read verses 5 through 13. Now, Rebekah was listening to what Isaac said to his son Esau. So while Esau went to the field to hunt some game to bring in, Rebekah said to her son Jacob, "Listen, I heard your father talking with your brother Esau. He said, 'Bring me game, make a delicious meal for me to eat so that I can bless you in the Lord's presence before I die.' Now, my son, listen to me and do what I tell you. Go to the flock and bring me 2 choice young goats, and I'll make them into a delicious meal for your father, the kind he loves. Then take it to your father to eat so that he will bless you before he dies." Jacob answered Rebekah, his mother, "Look, my brother Esau is a hairy man, but I'm a man with smooth skin. Suppose my father touches me, then I will be revealed to him as a deceiver, and I'll bring a curse rather than a blessing on myself." His mother said to him, "Your curse be on me, my son. Just obey me and go get them for me." And now down in verses 41 through 45. Esau, after this happened, holds a grudge against his brother Jacob because of the blessing his father had given him. And Esau determined in his heart, "The days of mourning for my father are approaching. Then I will kill my brother Jacob." The words of her older son Esau were reported to Rebekah. She summoned her younger son Jacob and said to him, "Listen, your brother Esau is consoling himself by planning to kill you. So now, my son, listen to me. Flee at once to my brother Laban in Haran and stay with him for a few days until your brother's anger subsides, until your brother's rage turns away from you and he forgets what you have done to him. Then I'll send for you and bring you back from there. Why should I lose both of you in one day?" I think if we consider the lives of Sarah and Rebekah, we've looked at the patriarchal side of this for a little bit with respect to Abraham and Isaac, and even beyond that, going as far back to Adam and maybe even looking a little bit more toward, or a little bit toward Jacob. Let's consider the matriarchal side for a second. Consider Sarah. And with this, we'll also, I think, sniff out some subtle hints of Eve even being interwoven into this. But when they both come onto the scene and we are told about their situation, they are both initially barren. Genesis 16, Genesis 25. Both of these women are held as childless. In Genesis 17, Sarah gains knowledge that her son is the one who will inherit the promise. Now remember, that comes obviously after Genesis 16. Genesis 16 is the incident in which Sarah gave Hagar to have a surrogate son in her place. That son is a living, breathing reality right now. So now God has shown up on the scene to give the promise of circumcision and its covenant implications, both blessing and judgment, and at the same time to specify with the most clarity he possibly can, it is not Ishmael, it is through Isaac your seed will be called. Of course, when Rebekah winds up getting pregnant and she realizes something is wrong in there, we know this story. She goes and inquires of the Lord somehow, and God supernaturally reveals to her it's not 1 but 2 in her belly, and these boys will wind up representing 2 full nations that will come from them. And for no fault of the older, some reason, somehow, God has sovereignly chose that the older will serve the younger. So she knows that at least one of these sons, a 50-50% chance that they are going to inherit this covenant blessing. But she is told before the children are even born exactly who that's going to be. And it's a little funny that by the time we get to this point in the story, we have leapfrogged over decades worth of Isaac's life. He was just a 40-plus-year-old man in the previous chapter, and his boys haven't even been born yet, and he's making covenants with other people. And now he's so old that his eyesight has faded from him, and he thinks he's going to die any day. He's trying to put his affairs in order and pass this blessing on to the son he favors, And we recognize also as the story develops that apparently there's a son Rebekah favors. Back to the third block of Sarah. She manipulates Abraham to bring about the desired end. We have to recognize it was painstaking for her to even think, much less utter the words that she wants her husband, who she's spent more than 6 decades with, to now go in and have intercourse with another woman for the sole purpose of having a child. But that will not be to her detriment because that child legally will be considered hers. So she's the one that ultimately gets to benefit because she then can say, if she remains childless, that Ishmael will be her son. What's going on here in the context of what we just read from Genesis 27, but the same thing. Is not Rebekah actually manipulating Isaac? I mean, he can't see. He doesn't know the difference between his sons except by the sound of their voice and the smell of their clothes and the feel of their skin. And these tactile things are the very things he relies on because his ears seem to be playing tricks on him because his eyes have totally failed. But yet his hands on the other side of that coin gives a totally different sense of interpretation as goes the data. Who is it that I'm actually talking to? You smell, you feel like Esau, but you sound like Jacob. But nevertheless, I'm an old man and I'm going to die soon. I think it might be you. I'm going to go ahead and give you the covenant blessing. Now, Jacob is supposed to get it all along. But is it really through these means of seduction and manipulation that he's supposed to wind up getting this covenant promise? Could God not have found another way? Is God the one orchestrating these events? Certainly not. I think if we are honest and we just take a moment to think on this a little deeper, we'll realize that Eve is actually doing the same thing in the garden. She's manipulating to get what she wants. What is it that she ultimately wants? It's what the serpent, the shining one, offers. Wisdom that is different than what God is offering to them, that allows them to circumvent God, cut him out of the equation, and be like him so that they now can have the power and the authority to decide what's right and wrong without having to be subsistent on him. Is it not? This seems to be a choice that's wise in her own eyes. The same as it is with Sarah. Even though God has not specified it will actually be through her, perhaps he needed to in her eyes, but it seemed clear enough to the rest of us it's obviously got to be because she's the only one he's married to. But this is what seems wise and prudent in her own eyes, and so this is what she leaps for. It reaps disaster. This is what is wise in Rebekah's eyes because it's now or never. Isaac's feeling something. He must think his time is nigh. He's going to croak and die, and he hasn't said which of these 2 boys it's going to be. I know it's going to be Jacob. Now, maybe she never shared that with him. And he's just operating under the assumption because God has never revealed this, presumably that we have record of, it's got to be Esau. Nonetheless, it's clear to the reader, but now it's got to become clear to the person who's going to receive the promise. And she moves forward with a decision that's wise in her own eyes. This results in a son who resents and mocks the younger brother with respect to Ishmael, because when the time comes for the celebration of the weaning of Isaac, what winds up happening? But he does something that is seen as obviously disrespectful in Sarah's eyes, and it fractures the family because she demands of Abraham, once again, you send her away. And now God says, it's time. He needs to go. And he consents and allows him. But nonetheless, for the rest of Abraham's life, do you not think that he longed for and missed his son whom he loved so much, Ishmael, even though he's not the covenant son? It's flesh of his flesh, bone of his bone. It winds up leading to exile. And the same thing happens with respect, obviously, to this story in Genesis 27, after this family is fractured, and it's not just a few days before Esau's anger is assuaged, 20 years go by. And the same thing happens with respect to Eve's actions. If you think about it, she did what was wise in her own eyes, and when that happens, what did they lose? And this. They're not allowed to stay in here anymore. Where are their children conceived? And then because of their decision that indirectly affects their progeny after them, we have the terrible calamity in Genesis 4 of one brother rising up to slay another brother. And what happens as a result of the brother who lives? God does what to him? He sends him further away. So it fractures her family even more because now Cain can't even be a part of them ever again. And lastly, I think it's also important to consider the idea that as the chapter ends, maybe in a dramatic way, Rebekah is drawing attention to the fact that Esau has married 2 Canaanite women, and for some reason they have just become embittered toward them. They are not perhaps wholesome women. They despise them. And in saying this, and also the events of what's going to transpire on the back end of this, that Isaac, even though it seems like Jacob is just going to hastily run off into the night and escape the wrath of his brother, there's actually a period or a moment when Isaac gets the chance to send off Jacob and do so legitimately, conferring the promise that he just gave him, and then saying you need to go to Padan Aram to get a wife for yourself while you're there. And then before that happens, Esau, hearing these words, is like, okay, I know my parents don't like my wives, so maybe if I got someone else, then maybe they might favor me more. Maybe he's thinking I can somehow supplant my brother and gain this promise back. But if anything, it just further solidifies his connection with exile by marrying a daughter of Ishmael. Now, for the rest of these slides, and I only got a couple of more, so don't despair in thinking we're not going to get through this tonight. We will. It's going to go rather quickly from here. But every one of these slides are all going to be titled Exile and Exodus, because every single one of these, as this story continues on in its momentum, patterns of momentum, it's going to be speaking toward that theme. So let's flip over to chapter 28 and just read about 5 verses. Chapter 28, verses 10 through 15. Jacob left Beersheba and went toward Haran. He reached a certain place and spent the night there because the sun had set. He took one of the stones from the place, put it underneath his head, and lay down in that place. And he dreamed. And a stairway was set on the ground with its top reaching into the sky, and God's angels were going up and down on it. The Lord was standing there beside him, saying, I am the Lord, the God of your father Abraham and the God of Isaac. I will give you and your offspring the land on which you are lying. Your offspring will be like the dust of the earth. You will spread out toward the west, the east, the north, and the south. All the people on earth will be blessed through you and your offspring. Look, I am with you, and I will watch over you wherever you go. I will bring you back to this land, for I will not leave you until I have done what I have promised you. We've already seen echoes of this story before in several places, but probably the most notable that follows it kind of point for point is what happens in Abraham's story. Abraham is called by the Lord in Genesis 12. That chapter ends with him going from north to south through the land of Canaan, and then he goes off where? So if he was in the promised land, coming in this direction, but then leaves the promised land, anytime God's people journey out of this space, not in the individual sense, but in the corporate sense, and considering that Abraham is the only one of the nation of Israel, or what will become the nation at this point, they are all bound up within him. He represents them all. So in him leaving the land, what would we call that movement? An exile. It's an exile. It's leaving the space that God intends to have them within. That's exactly what's happening here in Genesis 28. Jacob is being exiled from the land by virtue of his sin. Now, yes, God is promising he's going to bring him back. God is not sending him off in judgment. It's for the expediency of not suffering the wrath of his brother at this point for what he's done. But that would be a natural consequence and fallout for what has happened. Abraham, though, back in Genesis 12, before he actually winds up leaving Canaan, he actually winds up stopping between Bethel and Ai, and he winds up building an altar to the Lord. And by virtue of that, he's starting the process of what will happen in greater ways later on in the future by building more altars to the Lord. But he starts the process of establishing the presence and worship of Yahweh within the land. Where exactly is Jacob before he winds up leaving this space, going off up into this space? He's right there at Bethel. This is where he's meeting the Lord. And before back to Abraham, before he leaves, the Lord promises the land of Canaan to him. As he met with him in Genesis 12, before he goes off down into Egypt, as he's now in the land, the Lord appears and says, now that you are here, look around. This place I am giving to you and to your descendants after you. But then he leaves. He goes off down into Egypt. This prefigures the exile, not only of what's going to happen in Exodus, but of course later on with respect to them being expelled from the land and going off into captivity in Babylon. But it certainly has the idea of exile in Egypt on the horizon. And this is exactly what's happening here, although it's in somewhat reverse sequence because Jacob's not going south, he's going north. But nonetheless, he's here at Bethel, and God is saying that he is going to give him all of this land to possess. And again, it's prefiguring the exile into Egypt. How so? Because Jacob's people are going to leave the land as Jacob himself leads them out of the land and settles them in Egypt. But the promise from this moment on, as this is the first recorded moment we have Jacob dialoguing with God, is that this land belongs to you and to all of your descendants after you, who like the dust of the earth will spread out in every direction to fill the earth. Now, this one right here, this fourth box in orange, perhaps could be asterisked in the sense it's a little out of sequence. It's found for us in Genesis 15, but as part of the whole spectrum, it's still there. Because Abraham clearly hears and sees in this vision that he has that the Lord promises he will bring him back to the land. This is the very thing that God just finished this speech to Jacob with. I promise I will bring you back to this space. And both of these men erect monuments here. Abraham builds an altar near Bethel. And what does Jacob do with the stone that served as his pillow that night? He sets it up. He had some oil somewhere. He pulls it out and he pours it on top of it. And he dedicates this as a monument to the Lord, saying, if you will do all these things and bring me back to this place, then you will be my God. Why is it being repeated for us? It's to show us God is advancing the narrative forward, helping us see the value of the pattern as it's being laid down. So that way it's no big surprise that when the Exodus sequence comes along, God is not going to leave them out in the wilderness to starve, die, and roast to death underneath the blaring hot sun. He is going to bring them back to this place. More patterns as goes exile and Exodus. I would like to read some verses, but I think I'm going to have to just kind of truncate that and just develop this a little better on the screen. So anyway, let's talk about Jacob in captivity. Some of this stuff may have never occurred to you before, so it may be a little bit not shocking. It may be outright scandalous. I don't know. So if I say something that might throw you for a loop, stop me, raise your hand. We don't have to get through all of this. Again, I can finish up recording after everybody has to adjourn and leave. But if we're moving through the sequence in Genesis 29 on through 31, this is when Jacob arrives in Padan Aram, and he meets first Rachel and then learns of the status of his extended family, this brother that his mother spoke of that presumably Jacob has never met before, maybe only ever heard stories of, and then is escorted off to their house and then gets the chance to bond and reunite with the family and so forth. But as that happens, eventually, obviously Jacob doesn't go into that space with any family. He doesn't have a wife, much less 11 sons. But in the narrative space of what actually happens from 29 all the way up to the beginning of 31, what we do have is Jacob marrying two women and then also having intercourse with the concubines or slaves that became concubines, and for all intent and purpose, legal wives, that eventually wind up bearing 11 sons to him while he's in that space. While they're there, they are oppressed by a family member, Laban. He's the one that initially deceives Jacob, who thought he was working for Rachel's hand, but gets Leah instead. He can have Rachel within a week after marrying her, but has to stay on for another 7 years. And after that 14 years has gone by, he works another 6 years for Laban, trying to get a little something for himself. But Laban keeps changing his wages in the contract of their agreement 10 times. Maybe it was more than that. And nonetheless, trying to do all he could to keep Jacob penniless and completely dependent upon him so that he can manipulate and deceive him all the more. Now, when you consider the Joseph story, it's not too different from that. Once Joseph is actually in Egypt, he's wearing all the garb of the vizier and he has total control of the land, and he sees his brothers saunter on up wanting to transact money to buy grain to sustain them. Are their initial exchanges pleasant? Do they even know he's their brother? And does he seize the moment to exploit the advantage he has by having complete control and total authoritative power? Absolutely. I mean, before that first little exchange is over and done with and they're on their way back to the land with grain sacks on their donkeys, all 10 of them found their way in a jail, and then he kept one for the sake of letting the other 9 go so they could reprieve their families back home. But they have to come back if they want to retrieve their brother. How would you describe that as anything less than oppressive? Now, one might say, oh, vengeance and retribution for what they did to Joseph. That's true. But they don't know that this is Joseph. All they know is this man is a total tyrant. And that's exactly what they tell their father once they get back to the land. And then this all prefigures what will happen with Jacob's family when they are in Egypt, because Jacob leads the whole 70-plus group down there. But while they're there, things start off good, but do not end up well for them, as they are totally oppressed by a foreign ruler. And Laban, for all intent and purpose, though he's family, is yet still foreign. He's not part of the covenant promise. He is not intended to experience direct blessing by what God has passed from Abraham on down to Isaac and now Jacob. He's extended family, but yet at the same time, not meant to be a part of that kit and caboodle. So for all intent and purpose, we can see him and appreciate him as a foreigner. Moving on with this. Jacob starts a family. It greatly multiplies within a single generation. Same thing winds up happening once Jacob's family winds up moving down into Egypt. Within a few generations, they multiply like rabbits. Hundreds of thousands of them within just 4 simple generations. Or at least that's what the scriptural record winds up giving us. And then the same thing happens in the Exodus story, in spite of the fact Pharaoh tries to wipe out a whole generation of these boys. He starts trying to kill them, and they just keep on multiplying. Seems like that project eventually winds up getting abandoned. Moving back to Jacob, Jacob's flocks and herds, they all start multiplying and taking off, despite Laban's deceptive tactics. Again, not only the changing of the wages, but he even tries to take the animals that he promised he would give to Jacob through the breeding cycles, and then he moves all of those as separate flocks days away from the place where Jacob is actually allowing his flocks to graze and whatnot, but yet God is the one who is manipulating the circumstances to disfavorably disinherit Laban and give all of the spoil to Jacob. Same thing happens when they move down into Egypt. Flocks and herds multiply, and somehow through the phase of the oppression that lasts for maybe a couple of centuries, and even through the conflagration of Moses being in Egypt and the 10 plagues and all that happening, yet Pharaoh never once reaches his hands out against their flocks and herds, and they leave with a massive amount of both as they leave the land. Jacob and his 11 sons, they hastily leave Laban's care and they cross over a river, and with that, there's even judgment on God. You got this weird little moment there where when Laban finally catches up to them, the one thing he's looking for before he wants to go back is, where are his household idols? Well, we remember because the note was given to us in the narrative that Rachel, on her way out the door, stole them. Why would she do that? Who cares? Those are his trinkets, his little teraphim images and whatnot. Why does she want them? One of those things that we have to kind of go outside the Bible to understand a little better, which is the idea that once the patriarch of the family dies, the gods housed in the little shrine are passed on to the son who inherits the right of, through progenitorship, to basically become the new patriarch and head of the family. Whoever's house the shrine and the little gods dwell within, they're the head of the family. When Rachel stole the gods away from her father to carry them with her husband off to where they were going to go, what was that basically communicating off to her father, if he ever found out about this? That Jacob is the one now who basically is the head of this family and not Laban. In a sense, it's a judgment upon the gods that Laban gave his allegiance to. Same thing happens in Genesis 42 when Jacob's 10 sons wind up fleeing from Egypt. The first time they have an exchange with with Joseph, it's on bad terms because they didn't get along with him when they initially meet him there. And of course, later on, when they wind up fleeing the land of Egypt, it's the same thing because, granted, Pharaoh has been broken and gravely humbled by virtue of the fact his firstborn has been killed through the events of the 10th plague. But obviously it didn't sit well with him, and they didn't leave on good terms, considering the idea that within a matter of weeks, he's chasing them down to shed their blood and exact his retribution on them in the wilderness. Lastly, Jacob and his sons are overtaken by Laban before they eventually arrive home in Canaan. Same thing happens in the Joseph story. After they come down there with Benjamin and they get more grain and then they leave the land, what winds up happening? Joseph's steward comes out to find them, and they're like, hey, whoa, what's going on here? Because when he did, he does so with force. And they're like, what's the matter? You have stolen my master's divination cup. Then they tear open the sacks, and they're all mad and angry, like, how dare you accuse us of something like that? And then whose sack do they find it in? And then they're all torn to pieces because it has to be in the sack of the one that they all pledged their lives to give in the place of the one son that their own father was reluctant to let go of. And same thing obviously winds up happening too by virtue of the fact Jacob's family, when they come up to the vicinity of the Red Sea, are overtaken by Pharaoh again. Again, why are these sequences here? Why is all of this attention being given to something that really, if you're considering the idea of what's supposed to happen to Israel in captivity, hasn't even happened yet? Is this the only other time we're going to see this in the story of the Exodus as goes leaving Egypt? No. This is part of the much greater diorama that's not even the expulsion of the land off into captivity by Assyria or Babylon. It's the captivity of all the nations. This story is telling our story. Again, it's Israel as the microcosm of what humanity has done and is currently locked away in, and how God is, through this story of redemption, working to reverse all of that and bring us back to himself. All right, a few more minutes. Jacob in the wilderness. Before arriving at home, he meets with God at his camp. I just want to read the first couple of verses of Genesis chapter 32. So Jacob went on his way. God's angels met him, and when he saw him, Jacob said, "This is God's camp." So he called that place Mahanaim. So, just so you know, I didn't make that up. Pulled that right from the text. This is God's camp. Same thing with respect to Israel in the wilderness. Before they arrive in Canaan, because that's what the trajectory of the journey is, once they leave Egypt by means of the Red Sea, they come to camp out at Sinai. And then after they leave Sinai, which is where we begin the book of Numbers, somewhere around Numbers 10 is when they actually start to pull up stakes and move in that direction. And it's only supposed to be a month or more before they're at the southern edge of the land and ready to go in. And then what was a little journey turns into a whole 40-year wilderness wandering and the entire decimation, or I should say the decimation of an entire generation. But nonetheless, this is what happens. Before they enter the land, they come to meet up with God at his camp to experience and encounter him. Jacob, while he's here at this place, Mahanaim, he struggles with God. And he struggles with God for his blessing. And why does God change his name from Jacob to Israel? What does that name mean? The angel says to him, he has done what? He struggled with God and with man and prevailed. Now, not all of these parallels are always meant to be understood as positive. Sometimes these parallels are actually somewhat antithetical to each other because the same happens at Sinai, does it not? Does Israel not struggle with God? Now, in a sense, they actually do wind up receiving blessing because God never annihilates, and though he does threaten at times. Exodus 32, golden calf. But yet through the pleading of an intercessor, God winds up blessing, and he blesses by giving more of himself through these exchanges, by giving more Torah instruction and whatnot. But nonetheless, they struggle with God, and of course, there's a lot of negative consequence that comes by means of that. Jacob back in the wilderness, he pleads with the Lord based on God's promises to him. It should not be shocking then that Moses does the same thing after this moment of great struggle with Israel on their part with God in bowing the knee to an idol made to represent the God that brought them out of there, completely violating the terms of the covenant they just agreed to the chapter before. Correct? But nonetheless, as Jacob intercedes for himself based off the graciousness of God's promise, you said that you would give this to me, yet my brother has brought 400 men out to meet me. Obviously, his intent is incredibly clear. He seeks to obliterate me and anyone who is with me. Why else carry 400 men with you as an entourage? But you promised this to me. Same thing as goes the words of Moses. You would be right in annihilating them, but this is what you promised to their father Abraham. Back to Jacob. He meets Esau and all of his armed forces in the wilderness before Israel enters into the land of Canaan as they're starting the terminal end of that 40-year wilderness wandering. They're about to start the descent onto the east side of the land before they will cross over the Jordan. And who do they meet out in the wilderness? They actually sent an envoy to the king and representative of Edom, the territory of Esau, to say, look, we won't even drink the water. And anything that we need, we will pay fair price for. We're not asking you to inconvenience yourself in any way. What happens? They don't simply send an envoy to say, no, It's kind of a hard pass for us. They actually arm men and send them out to the border to make sure they got the message loud and clear. Not a foot. Not a foot. And then back to Jacob. He stops short of Canaan, and he temporarily settles in the land of Sukkot. And Sukkot, its Hebrew term, or as a Hebrew term, means shelters. And how does Israel wind up living for the vast extent of their wilderness wandering? In tents. I mean, the whole entire festival is dedicated to this very thing, to experience what that was like after the Passover is over and done with. All right, last slide. So, sigh of relief, right? We got there right before the time ran out on us. But Jacob's still in the wilderness. Before returning to Bethel, Dinah is sexually defiled. Now, I have to say this real quick so that we understand the importance of this. Because if you go back and you read this, you're like, well, exile is supposed to be over with, right? Because once the children of Israel cross Jordan and they're into the land, Joshua celebrates the Passover and all these things. Exile's done. The manna stops. Jacob's back in the land, so exile's over and done with. Where did he leave from? Where did he meet God at? Where did God say, I'll bring you back to this land? And where did Jacob in return say, if you bring me back here to this spot where I set up a stone and anointed it with oil, then you will be my God? He's not there yet. So is the exile actually over with, even though he's in the land? No. And what happens before this? His daughter is raped by a man named Shechem. Now, he wants to marry her, make her an honest girl after he did this terribly awful thing. Nonetheless, this is what winds up happening to Israel while they're out in the wilderness. They are sexually defiled, seduced by the women of Midian through a ploy that Balaam was actually able to use as a means to discredit them before the Lord and bring about God's wrath and curse upon them because he could not speak such with his mouth. An invitation to intermarry is extended by Shechem to exchange their sons and daughters with each other. Now, obviously, going back to Genesis 9, people of Canaan, kind of forbidden fruit, not supposed to happen. The same thing, for the most part, happens in Numbers 25. As a moment in which this Midianite seduction is happening, a man actually intends to bring a woman into the tent and have her there, which would mean bringing her into the tent. Go back to the Isaac story. What happens when Isaac marries Rebekah? Where does he take her to consummate the marriage? He's got his own tent. He takes her into his mother's tent. That's a ritual that's foreign to us, but that is significant, as goes the idea of recognizing the legitimacy and the consummation of the marriage. The Hebrew linguistics of the actual text itself seems to suggest this is exactly what his intent is. And to do so means to make a legitimate union between him and this Midianite chieftain's daughter. Forbidden. God is completely outlined in the law. This is not acceptable in any way, shape, or form. Blood is shed by the hand of Levi in retribution, back in Jacob's story. In the Midianite story of Numbers 25, Phinehas, who is from Levi's house because he's the grandson of Aaron, the high priest, goes and kills the Midianite woman. If he's a son of Aaron, he is obviously a... Simeon is also a co-conspirator with Levi. Remember the story? They tell them, hey, yeah, we'll give you some of our daughters, but to do so to an uncircumcised family would be disgraceful to us. If you want to intermarry with us, you're going to have to circumcise yourselves. Hey, whatever, we'll do anything to have her. Okay, so they circumcise themselves. And while the men are there healing, these two men are able to go and completely subdue an entire town of warriors and put everybody to the sword. Two men. Not because they were supernaturally endowed with power like David or Shammah or any of these other guys were, because everybody's healing from their wounds. And consider the idea that it was the very mark of blessing by which a man is supposed to be recognized as an heir to the covenant promise of Abraham. And if you wanted to become a part of Abraham's family and observe the Passover, you could do that, but you're going to have to be circumcised. They were, in essence, extending the chance for you to become a part of Abraham's family, and they turned that into a curse. Detestable. The Israelite man that was killed by Phinehas was a Simeonite who was actually trying to marry with the Midianite woman. And lastly, Jacob returns to Bethel. The exile ends. The covenant is reaffirmed. And of course, the wilderness wanderings on the backside of Deuteronomy end with Israel entering Canaan. Exile ends and the covenant is reaffirmed. So I know a lot, as goes patterns and trying to recognize and see where the story is going. But it speaks in a lot of ways. One thing I think that we should also be careful to remember as well is we continue to see the repetition of the calamity of God's people working to subvert God's intent and his agenda by virtue of their own hard, stubborn, calloused hearts. Described euphemistically by Moses and Joshua as them being stiff-necked, not wanting to be led. And this is meant to cause us to ask questions of the text, as goes our own hearts. How do we respond to such in faith? Because this story, again, is our story. We are a part of this new and final Exodus. We have been brought into the promised land, per se, considering the idea that all of creation is being made new by the King who rules cosmically at the right hand of the Father. But do we respond in the same way with hard, calloused hearts, as opposed to being transformed into the likeness of his image? After all, that's what God is after here, is their hearts, and they continue to refuse to give them to them. And as we've seen tonight, God covenants, and then what happens in the next part of the story? Flubbery. Tomfoolery. And sadly, it's never to anybody's benefit or good purpose. So, any lingering comments or questions before we wrap up tonight?
I guess a couple questions.
Sure.
I guess the first one would be like, would you consider that the way that, and maybe this really has more to do with next week. Actually, I'll just can that question because it has more to do with next week. When we see like, Isaac dies and then, or Abraham dies and then it's Ishmael, and then it's Isaac dies and then it's Esau's lineage. Because this is written not to us but to the people of the times, would it have served the purpose of like, these are your relatives, these are your family, and yet they are outside of the covenantal promise? Is that like more why they serve like almost as like a juxtaposition between the two of like, this is the man who received the covenant promise, and this is his failure, his sin. It's almost like all laid out there, to say like, this is the result of your sin. This should have never happened. These people actually should have never existed. And the reader of the time would know, man, Edom has been a pain in our side. The Canaanites have been a pain in our side. We're actually super afraid of the Canaanites, etc., etc.
Yes, I think so. And at the same time, it is a glimmer of hope for these peoples, considering the idea of what happens with respect to Lot. Has Lot done anything to prove himself to be righteous in the story? But yet he's the one person that's saved from the city. And for every reason we could guess, it's probably because of Abraham and his extension to him. Even though he's talked about as a righteous man in the writings of the New Testament authors, yet we have nothing to bear that out in the story itself. So it would seem like the grace extended to Abraham, almost like an umbrella, is also extended to his family. Hence the reason why it's reaching outside of the members of the land of Canaan to receive a wife for his son, and the same thing with respect to his grandson, rather than these people. When you consider that, juxtaposing it against the stories of people like Ruth, a Moabitess, who the Moabites are forbidden to enter into the sacred space and worship along with the assembly of God's people, not only with the tabernacle in mind, but the temple too. So how does this woman wind up becoming part of the lineage of Messiah, considering that curse? Something like that. And the same thing with respect to Edom. They are forbidden from conquering the territory of Edom at any point in their future. Abraham was promised that he is going to have kings descend from him. And while David does for a time subdue Edom and strip them of their king, yet they don't go in and set up garrisons and occupy the place and then tyrannically enforce taxes and all these other things. They are told that is for Edom. God has, as he has given a space for Jacob's descendants, Canaan, as that was always promised to the descent of Abraham, in the proper line of descent. Yet for Esau, God has given him Edom, and they are to maintain that space and leave it to them. And Esau, they're kind of, it's like they almost fade out into obscurity with respect to where they wind up settling, because they settle amongst the Edomites, and they even settle further south amongst the Midianites, and then way down into the southern tip of what we would now call Saudi Arabia. Because as goes the distinct space where they live, they were nomads for much of their known existence. And their name is even used interchangeably with respect to the Joseph story that we'll get in next week. Who was it? Was it a caravan of Ishmaelites or a caravan of Midianites who came to collect Joseph? Probably both. So hopefully that answers your question in a way, by saying a glimmer of hope that yes, it's supposed to be a distinction as to who is the covenant or line of covenant descent and the blessing. And again, I think that hopefully that clears up some measure of ambiguity too. In the first part of the story, when Esau sells his birthright for a bowl of stew, he's not selling the covenant blessing. The birthright is not the covenant blessing. Because if Jacob had gotten that through buying it through or the exchange of, you gave that to me as a contractual obligation, though verbally, for this bowl of stew, it would still be honored in their time. Why does he have to manipulate his father to get this later on in Genesis 27? That's the covenant blessing that he's after, to get both. The birthright is who gets to inherit more once the father dies, as goes land and possessions and so forth. Any other questions? All right. Well, as always, I say save them up till next week.
I didn't want to hold you guys any longer.
Yeah. All right. Well, thanks for listening.